To many Australians, this is our most sacred place, a shrine to the sacrifice of our fallen.
Here is their spirit in the heart of the land that they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves have made.
The War Memorial means to me is that it's the heart and soul of the Australian spirit.
For more than 80 years, this war memorial has stood elegantly in the landscape, a solemn shrine to 100,000 Australians who made the ultimate sacrifice. A simple gem of a building, just as its creator envisaged. Now all that's changing fast. The Australian War Memorial itself has become a battleground, fought over by those who want it to expand and evolve, and by those who warn that it's being turned into a $500 million military theme park that celebrates rather than commemorates war.
I'm appalled by it. It's a kind of Disneyland of war.
Redevelopment is, to put it bluntly, an abomination.
Why was an expansion of the War Memorial required?
Because we ran out of space.
Not only is there outrage over the expansion, but serious questions have been raised about government funding processes, conflicts of interest, and the awarding of lucrative contracts.
No one should be entitled to allocate $500 million of public money to a project without a business case.
Those sorts of things, as they should do, raise red flags.
The memorial is also under fire for accepting money from the world's biggest weapons makers.
I think that is disgusting.
No, it's not disgusting. I don't feel the slightest embarrassment with weapons manufacturers contributing.
As long as it's done discreetly, I don't have a problem. Now, I think that's dirty money. It should not be accepting money from merchants of death.
It was the war that was supposed to end all wars. The industrial-scale slaughter of World War I took the lives of more than 60,000 Australians. A war still solemnly commemorated more than a century after the guns fell silent.
It was a war that reached into every Australian community, every Australian home. And Australians needed a way to understand and mark that important point in their nation's development. And Charles Bean saw that the idea of a national war memorial was the way to do that.
Charles Bean was Australia's official correspondent in World War I, landing at Gallipoli with the ANZACs on the 25th of April 1915. The following year, he was in France, documenting the horrors of the Western Front.
And he walked that battlefield after the battle had moved on. And he thought to himself, nobody back home in Australia will ever understand what these men went through, and they should.
He thought there has to be a place back in Australia where families can come and grieve and mourn loved ones, because these bodies were not going to be coming home.
And so was born the idea of an Australian War Memorial.
Australia gave unsparingly, ungrudgingly, the best and the bravest of our young manhood. And it is in their honour that this memorial has been erected.
Charles Bean's vision was finally realised in 1941, in the middle of another world conflict. It was as he conceived of it, in his words, not colossal in scale, but rather a gem of its kind. In this carefully planned, architect-designed capital city, much thought was given to the location of key national institutions, imbuing Canberra with layers of meaning. There's no greater example of this than the geographic relationship between Parliament House and the Australian War Memorial.
The idea behind it, I think, is that our politicians in Parliament making decisions that affect everyday Australians, things that might lead us as a country into war, they should be able to walk out, look down that sight line and actually see the true cost of the decisions that they're making.
We do not know this Australian's name, and we never will. We do not know his rank or his battalion. We do not know who loved him or whom he loved.
Over the years, the War Memorial has honoured Bean's vision of paying homage to sacrifice. No greater example of this was the 1993 interment of an unknown Australian soldier, exhumed from a World War I cemetery in France. The inheritors of Charles Bean's simple, solemn vision are now massively expanding the memorial. This place of commemoration is also a construction site.
There was something very, very Australian about that building sitting gently in that beautiful landscape, and that's all gone.
I don't agree with the criticisms where they say it was meant to be a gem of its kind and therefore you stop. Because Bean also said we were out to create, if possible, the finest, and he called it, war museum of its kind in the world. Now, you don't do that by stopping. You don't do that by remaining static.
The soul of a nation. That's what's housed within its stone and brass walls. It's sacred to us all. It transcends politics. It just transcends all of us.
In November 2018, at a ceremony in Parliament's Great Hall, the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, endorsed plans to expand the memorial.
So today I am pleased to announce that the government is backing these plans, providing $498 million over the next 9 years to see these plans fulfilled.
When I heard about that, I immediately thought they can't be serious, because $500 million is an awful lot of money to spend on something that nobody's discussed.
The institution's then director and the expansion's champion, former Liberal leader and ex-Defence Minister Brendan Nelson, was ecstatic.
And thank you. A great day for Australia. A great day for thank you. Yeah, no, thank you.
The memorial's then chairman, the media mogul Kerry Stokes, drove the project along with Brendan Nelson.
It is within that building that we reveal our character as a people. We reveal our soul.
The redevelopment of the memorial, I think, is the brainchild and the legacy of Brendan Nelson. And I think he wanted to leave his mark on the memorial, and his way of doing it was to go to his mate Scott and say, "Scotty, can you lend us $500 million?" Scotty was very happy to oblige.
The opportunity and the responsibility our nation now has is to tell the stories of what has been done in recent years in Afghanistan, Iraq, the Solomon Islands and East Timor.
Normally, for changes to such an important national monument to proceed, it has to clear multiple hurdles, including passing federal heritage rules, getting past the parliamentary committee that oversees public buildings, and obtaining approval from the authority in charge of the National Capital Precinct. And critics say the then Prime Minister Scott Morrison ignored proper process right from the start, making the funding announcement before the $11 million final business case for the expansion had even been completed and considered.
There's no doubt that there was a political fix in this, in the sense that it was actually primarily driven by politicians. And when you blend politicians and war memorials, you get a bad mix.
It was done without a detailed business case having been completed or considered. Do we know why that happened?
The government had everything it needed at the time that it took the decision to take that decision with 75% confidence, and that was all then backed in by the detailed business case.
What about 100% confidence? Wouldn't that have been better?
Oh, well, I think that's the ideal world.
With an election looming in 2022, Scott Morrison approved an additional $50 million for the redevelopment, a week before the War Memorial formally asked for it. Four Corners wanted to ask Mr Morrison why he approved more than $500 million for the expansion without considering the final business case. But he declined to be interviewed and he ignored questions. This expansion will increase the exhibition space here at the War Memorial by about 80%. It'll open up new displays and new galleries. But critics say it's simply too massive, that it's going to strangle Bean's simple gem of a building. This video, released by the War Memorial, set to waltzing Matilda, shows how the expansion will look, with exhibits of a fighter jet and other large military equipment.
I can't understand why it has to be so big. The new building will dominate the memorial, which is one of the most loved icons in Australia.
Redevelopment is, to put it bluntly, an abomination. It should never have happened.
At that time, I, as it turns out naively, had faith in the checks and balances and heritage legislation that would protect the site.
The expansion encountered its first opposition when the Australian Heritage Council warned it would have serious impacts on the memorial.
Well, they wrote two letters. They wrote one to the War Memorial and one to the department. Both of those said that they couldn't support the proposal in its current form.
This is the government's own heritage advisor.
Exactly, independent heritage advisor. I thought that, that can't go any further.
Despite these concerns, the government signed off on the redevelopment.
I think that by ignoring its own Heritage Advisory Council, it shows how little genuine connection there was to the consultation.
The redevelopment was also scrutinised by Parliament's powerful Public Works Committee.
The Public Works Committee got more submissions than they'd ever received on any project since, I think, 1913 when it was instigated, right? And the majority of those submissions were against the development.
But it ticked it off anyway.
Yeah, exactly. So many red flags.
That left one last hurdle: the National Capital Authority, the federal agency that oversees planning and development in Canberra.
Everything was just falling into place. It was not going to be able to stop. I didn't have much faith in the NCA stopping it.
So by the time all the information was on the table and the National Capital Authority considered this project, and they doubled the time that was normally available for public consultations, the majority of submissions I think you'll find were in favour of it.
Well, I believe the National Capital Authority got 601 submissions, only 3 in favour?
No, that's not right.
That's not right. So what was the figure?
My understanding is the majority of submissions to the National Capital Authority were in favour of it. Happy to fact check that one.
Four Corners did fact check that. And the National Capital Authority's first stage approvals involving demolition work for the redevelopment did receive a record 601 submissions, with only 3 explicitly in favour of the expansion plans. Despite this, the NCA approved the work, which included knocking down the memorial's award-winning ANZAC Hall and felling 140 trees. By the time the second stage of the process had been reached, the majority of submissions were in favour of the redevelopment.
What do you say to those who say, well, look, Morrison came out, he gave $500 million, it was a captain's call, then everyone fell into line. The Environment Minister, then the Public Works Committee, and then the National Capital Authority then went stamp, stamp, stamp.
Well, I'm not sure everybody fell into line, but those that did fall into line, I'm glad they did.
It was a dodgy process. At every stage, it was waved through. So you'd have to ask yourself, does the system work? In this case, the system clearly didn't work because an unjustifiable redevelopment was allowed to proceed.
With the National Capital Authority approval, the War Memorial could get to work on the first phase of the redevelopment, knocking down ANZAC Hall, an addition to the memorial that was only 20 years old and whose elegant lines won Australia's top public architecture prize, the Solemn Cowan Award.
It had this fantastic way of sitting in reverence to the original War Memorial building.
It couldn't be expanded. The design they'd chosen couldn't be expanded. So the decision was taken to knock it down.
For its award-winning creator, the decision to demolish ANZAC Hall was devastating.
It was pretty painful. It was really shocking to us that they would do it. We sort of carried all these hopes that maybe the National Capital Authority will say no,
Don't do that.
A former director of the memorial is so outraged, he's speaking out against the redevelopment.
I did describe the whole process as architectural vandalism. And it shows a total disrespect for quality architecture, the sort you should have on a major Commonwealth institution, so important to the Australian people as the Australian War Memorial.
I'm very, very confident that what we've done won't affect that historic silhouette. It won't affect what people know and love, the iconic nature of the building, because it's not, of course, just a Canberra landmark, it's a national symbol.
Already, the management of the redevelopment has come under fire, with the Australian National Audit Office, or the ANAO, uncovering some troubling information involving contracts and possible conflicts of interest.
You read a lot of reports, that's your job really as a senator, but this one really stuck out.
What the ANAO found was that while the management of the project was largely effective, there was evidence of poor record keeping, of undeclared conflicts of interest involving contracts worth more than $150 million, and of the memorial taking steps to vary one contract so that it came in $1 below the threshold that triggers ministerial scrutiny.
I thought that was quite extraordinary. When you see a contract signed for $999,999 in order to avoid a $1 million threshold and ministerial oversight, I mean, how could that be happening?
Because you think you're not going to get ministerial approval, or you do not want prying eyes examining the details, the entrails of your transaction.
The truth about that contract, we always expected to be about 800,000, which didn't require ministerial approval. We just wanted to allow a bit of headroom.
It's a very convenient amount of contingency, isn't it? That has all the hallmarks of a retrospective justification.
Well, it didn't look good, and that's why the Auditor General called it out. Those sorts of things, as they should do, raise red flags, and you want to make sure that there is actually no problem.
It would appear, though, coming in $1 under $1 million, that they want to keep the minister out of the loop here.
Well, it certainly would appear that way, and if you're an auditor and you look at that and think that's ridiculous, and if you're a minister and you see that in an auditor's report, you think that is ridiculous, what are you doing?
The auditor told us that sent a red flag. Now, the disappointing element of that is, the contract came in at about $820,000, so well below that anyway. So there was no need to do that. So I can't understand why they did it, but they did it.
It does look like an attempt to dodge ministerial scrutiny to the untrained or the trained eye even.
Well, that was the auditor's sense, was it was a red flag, and that's a fair enough assessment, and it certainly could have been executed better.
That does look a little strange.
It was not clever. And
not clever.
Not clever.
The Audit Office wasn't just concerned about apparent attempts to avoid ministerial scrutiny. It also found that possible conflicts of interest in the awarding of contracts were not adequately documented and declared.
And I'd also say, at the risk of embarrassing him, the project manager for this, the managing director, is a man called Wayne Hitches.
One of those possible conflicts of interest involved Wayne Hitches, who's in charge of the redevelopment project. He'd worked in a high-level position at Lend-Lease months before the developer was awarded multi-million-dollar redevelopment contracts. The Audit Office found Mr Hitches failed to complete a conflict of interest declaration. In a statement to Four Corners, Mr Hitches did not answer our question as to why he did not fill in the declaration, but said his former role with Lend-Lease was known by the War Memorial Executive and by the then Minister. Just over 3 years after awarding that initial contract to Lend-Lease, Mr Hitches finally signed a conflict of interest declaration. By that time, Lend-Lease had won another contract, this time worth $130 million.
Does that pass any kind of scrutiny pub test? I think everybody would reject it, and the ANAO rejected it. This is an obvious conflict of interest that should never have been permitted.
All I can say is that we were satisfied that all conflicts were either expressly noted or were well known.
But it wasn't documented?
It's a concern that it wasn't documented, although everybody knew. Everybody in the industry, everybody at the War Memorial, it was common knowledge that he'd come from Lend-Lease.
But according to the Audit Office, one person who didn't know that Mr Hitchens had come from Lend-Lease was the War Memorial's own probity advisor. The Memorial's chairman defends Mr Hitchens' role in the project and in considering contracts.
When he was appointed, the Minister of the day announced it and announced the fact that he had worked for Lend-Lease.
So it's not a conflict of interest, it's sloppy paperwork?
It's not a conflict of interest.
So why not just fill in a conflict of interest declaration?
Because we'd all thought that that was all done and dusted years before.
But you can understand the Minister said, you know, it probably should have been done.
Well, that's whatever the Minister says is obviously what must be done.
The process was deficient, and when those processes are deficient, you can find yourself that there were conflicts of interest that no one knew about.
But it went beyond deficient processes. The Audit Office also found that Lend-Lease was briefed about a failed contract bid that may have allowed it to improve its tender for the biggest contract of them all, ultimately worth $130 million. The auditors were also critical of the War Memorial for not providing the Minister with sufficient detail in its briefs about the redevelopment and contracts.
Well, frankly, I wasn't happy. There was clear deficiencies that were brought up in the report, things that hadn't been done properly and processes that needed to be improved.
Despite the Minister's unhappiness, the War Memorials Director describes the Audit Office's findings as positive.
They went through and they found that the project represents value for money for the taxpayer. So by that score, yes, of course, I think it's a positive audit.
He mustn't have read the report or the same report as I read. The report that I read had problems from the start to the finish.
The War Memorial's conduct in another area has also drawn fire, namely from whom it is willing to accept money. Do you believe that it's appropriate that weapons manufacturers should have any sponsorship or funding role or any monetary links with the War Memorial?
Yes, I do. I don't feel the slightest embarrassment with weapons manufacturers contributing.
Last year, at the largest defence industry event ever held in Australia, the world's leading weapons makers were proudly promoting their wares. Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Thales, BAE Systems, Northrop Grumman. Those same companies have also proudly sponsored the Australian War Memorial, an involvement that appalls many who say it contradicts the mission of the memorial.
Now, I think that's dirty money. It's not money that the Australian War Memorial, which of all places should be conscious of the consequences of conflict, of all places, it should not be accepting money from merchants of death.
As long as it's done discreetly and it's done by reputable manufacturers, I don't have a problem.
We wouldn't have the alcohol industry commemorating or having anything to do with those who die in traffic accidents. The weapons companies profit, they make huge profits when nations go to war, and it's inappropriate that they're commemorated in the same institution.
I cannot believe that good governance would enable the War Memorial to take that money, and I don't care how much it is. I think that is disgusting.
You are ill-advised, sir.
It's not disgusting.
No, it's not disgusting. We had to defend ourselves.
I don't believe that having a relationship with those companies that support the Australian Defence Force in the defence of our freedoms and our values is in any way a compromise for the Australian War Memorial.
So if weapons manufacturers want to donate, you're okay with that?
Yeah, so long as we decide what we spend that money on and how we spend it and the stories that we tell.
But the links between the memorial and weapons companies reach even deeper into this place. When former Defence Minister Brendan Nelson was director, he also had a paid role with French arms maker Thales, which makes Bushmaster armoured vehicles and a range of munitions, weapons and electronics for Australian forces. The fact that he worked for Thales wasn't disclosed until 4 years later.
Yeah, it's totally fucked. I know you're going to put that to air, but sorry, that's just wrong.
What Brendan did, of course, in this process was he sought permission of the chairman of the council. He then sought the permissions of the Minister for Veterans Affairs. And, of course, any fees that he paid were donated straight to the War Memorial.
Would you take an outside gig with a weapons manufacturer while running this place?
No, I've got enough on my hands.
Four Corners can reveal that Brendan Nelson earned nearly $200,000 from Thales, money he donated to the memorial, effectively meaning he spent 5 years working for Thales for free.
You can't be the director of the War Memorial on one hand and then having a side contract and accepting funds from a French multinational arms manufacturer on the other hand. And the idea that that can be resolved by donating the money you get from the French arms manufacturer, I think is bizarre. Also, who does that?
Within weeks of leaving the War Memorial as director, Dr. Nelson joined Boeing in a top-tier role. And while at one of the largest weapons manufacturers in the world, he rejoined the War Memorial on its council before becoming its chairman.
We all have to believe that tomorrow is going to be better than today.
Dr. Nelson, now president of Boeing Global, declined Four Corners' request for an interview and to respond to written questions. The links between the Memorial Council and weapons companies didn't end with Brendan Nelson.
You're a board member with defence company Lewison, you're advisor to Lockheed Martin.
Yeah.
Is that appropriate for the chairman of the War Memorial, in your view, to be linked?
Provided it's declared, yes.
Do you think it's appropriate?
That I am on those other bodies as well, yes, I do. But what would not be appropriate is that if I didn't declare it.
Of course, but none of these roles is on the War Memorial website as far as I can see. Should they be?
I'm very happy if they put them on the website.
The War Memorial's website is yet to update Mr. Beasley's CV.
Of course, the chair of the War Memorial should not, on the one hand, be the chair of the council to run a sacred memorial about the sacrifice and the horrors of war on one hand, and then have multiple paid roles in the defence industry. It's an appalling conflict of interest.
But it's the sizable presence of one of Australia's most decorated soldiers that sparked much debate about how this institution confronts hard truths.
Our focus was to locate the senior members of the Taliban and to capture or kill them. That was the job.
The memorial, of course, had a very intense emotional connection with Ben Roberts-Smith. You know, it virtually adopted him as its mascot for a while. But the memorial should have realised that that could not go on because of what we now know about his conduct.
In 2023, former SAS soldier Ben Roberts-Smith was found in a defamation trial he initiated to have committed war crimes in Afghanistan. That judgment forced the War Memorial into an embarrassing rethink about one of its popular exhibits. Robert Smith's uniform and his Victoria Cross displayed in the memorial's revered Hall of Valour.
What we did do is put a plaque contextualising and mentioning the allegations.
We noted, of course, that he also appealed, which he has. Just remind that he's not been found guilty of any criminal offence.
The panel next to the display is, to me, the most mealy-mouthed piece of writing the memorial's ever put up. It was completely inadequate because it didn't explain the moral vacuum that those soldiers had fallen into.
Ben Robert Smith is now under investigation by the federal agency in charge of prosecuting Australian soldiers over alleged war crimes.
Between rifle shots and IED, soldier comes home, broken in ways invisible to most.
Allegations of misconduct in Afghanistan aren't the only hard truths the Australian War Memorial is struggling to confront.
You know when things trigger and he's sweating, can't sleep.
Richard Franklin is a Defence Force veteran, a filmmaker and a singer-songwriter.
Come home, my broken soldier.
He's also a proud Gunditjmara man from Western Victoria, with a family history of service and sacrifice in both world wars.
My mob are known as the Fighting Gunditjmara. My great-grandfather, John Galt, was in the 1st Cameronian Rifles, and he died in the Somme.
He screams inside.
And my uncle Harry, he died on the Kokoda Trail.
On a good day, he hides that broken soul. Come on, come home, soldier blue. Come on, come home, soldier blue.
The sacrifice of Richard Franklin's uncle is recognised at the Australian War Memorial.
I'm already gone, my soldier blue.
But that's not the case with other ancestors who fought and died in conflicts. Here, on Australian soil, conflicts known as the Frontier Wars.
For us to grow as a nation, for us to be united, for us to have a common vision for victory, we have to have the courage to recognise the past for what it truly is.
For 20 years, Richard Franklin has been campaigning for the Australian War Memorial to recognise his ancestors, the Indigenous warriors who fought back against the white settlers.
Tell you what, I want to take you to a place tomorrow, and I think it's going to be a bit of a shock to you. It's a place where a lot of this stuff sort of began. But you need to see it, mate. This is Emu Creek, and further up there, I mean, there's massacres and battles and murders all over this country, but just up there was a pretty big one, about 39 people, they reckon.
39?
Yeah, men, women and kids. Like this whole creek here, the records say it was running red with blood.
This place would become known as Murdering Gully. Just one of the many bloody episodes of a frontier war that lasted more than a century and took tens of thousands of lives.
These are First Nation Australian unsung heroes who died bravely fighting for their country, fighting for their families, fighting for their land and waters, fighting for their dignity. The only way that we're going to heal is if we examine the past. And if organisations, very important bodies like the Australian War Memorial step up, they need to lead the charge in this. They need to step up.
The War Memorial to me is one of Australia's most important places. It is sacred, but it's missing a profound element, and until it truly comes to terms with the foundational war that made this country what it is, it will never be truly whole.
Rachel Perkins is a Narunda and Kalkadoon woman from Central Australia. She wrote, produced and directed an award-winning documentary series, The Australian Wars.
So why? Why do we still deny it happened? And why, more fundamentally, in the place that calls itself the Australian War Memorial, why do we not give just recognition to the war that actually founded the Australian modern nation?
From my perspective, no, the War Memorial is more appropriately devoted to uniform conflicts, fighting enemies against Australia, rather than internal conflicts, which I think is better dealt with in the overall history of Australia.
Greg Mellick should walk in our shoes. My family were run down by men on horseback with Snider repeater rifles and murdered in their hundreds. So those warriors who were involved in trying to defend their families and their country in that moment do not get recognition in the War Memorial. Explain that to me.
Some historians argue that the colossal scale of killing in the frontier wars has not been adequately recognised by the War Memorial, and still won't be in the new expanded galleries.
It's planning to depict frontier conflict in the so-called pre-1914 gallery, and that's 1% of the memorial's floor space.
To this day, the War Memorial refuses to recognise the frontier conflicts as a war.
I think Council has resolved clearly that we would portray frontier violence more broadly and more deeply in the galleries. That's the Council's position. That's the Memorial's position.
A simple, solemn building. Not colossal in scale, but rather a gem of its kind. That was Charles Bean's vision for an Australian War Memorial. A place where the horrors of war being witnessed would be remembered and its victims honoured. But more than 80 years after this shrine was opened, there is concern that something sacred is being lost.
I think Bean's vision has been compromised. So what we're seeing really is a pumped-up memorial, a memorial on steroids, not a memorial of the kind that we needed and we had.
It will be a place where people can understand the Australian experience of war up to and including today.
I find it difficult to go up there. You put a lot of your life into it. It's difficult to reconcile the fact it's been destroyed, I think, for no real reason.
It's still TripAdvisor's #1 visited point in Canberra, and it's still in the top 10% of the free-to-entry parks, memorials, whatever, around the globe. This is an example of Australian excellence.
I grew up in Canberra. I lived with my parents behind the War Memorial. Development needs to occur, the place needs to evolve, but my personal feeling is it'll go down as one of the worst examples of architecture and heritage destruction that this country has seen, and I think that's unforgivable.